My last two videos have been going over 4 key qualities of consciousness. That is, they have been describing how consciousness is limited, coordinated, unitary, and managerial, touching on the brain from time to time. Now we are going to take a more direct look at how these features and consciousness itself operate within the brain. We can see how consciousness is limited, not just by the setup of our senses, but by the fact that much of the brain is given over to regional activities such as preliminary sensory processing that don't enter into consciousness directly. But how about coordination? How does consciousness get coordinated? If brain impulses traveled roughly as fast as light like computer impulses, coordination would be easy. But as explained earlier, the average brain impulse travels at roughly 50 miles an hour. Combine that with the fact that the brain is highly specialized, with sight, hearing, touch, feelings, thought, and so on being handled in different areas, and coordination of something as wide-ranging as consciousness becomes a major hurdle. So even though we know that the brain processes information in a massively parallel way, essentially all at once, rather than one thing at a time like a computer, we still need to ask how it surmounts this hurdle. It appears to do so in several steps. Start with regionalization. Regionalization is actually an advantage because it permits the brain to do the basic processing of different incoming signals in different specialized areas. This basic processing doesn't have to enter into consciousness, and it generally doesn't. It's only after such processing gets pretty far along and gets associated with other results from other areas in brain regions aptly termed association areas that it reaches a point where it may enter into consciousness. By then a good deal of selecting has been done, and most of the processing is moved over to the sides or top of the head, places that are relatively close together and also close to coordinating structures inside the cerebral hemispheres. Here's the geometry and speed. The average adult brain is about 5 inches across. So a single 50-mile-an-hour trip going roughly 2.5 inches from the outer fringe to the center, allowing for some meandering, would take about 3/1000ths of a second. This means that roughly 100 such trips, or roughly 50 round trips, could be made in 3/10ths of a second. It's hard to measure just how long some specific incoming information takes to enter conscious awareness, and the actual time required probably varies according to circumstances. However, careful experiments by neuroscientists Benjamin Libet and others indicate that various sorts of stimuli take at least 3/10ths of a second to enter into conscious awareness. If so, the simple brain layout shown here appears to permit the sort of rich feedback and recurrent signaling that consciousness requires. Well then, what about the unity of consciousness? That requires more than just recurrent signaling and feedback. It requires coherence. It requires selection and unification intense enough so that any part of the brain receiving this coherent information will find it consistent with similar information registering in other brain areas. How is this unity achieved? It looks as though it is done through centralized coordination that results in a weeding out, selection, and harmonization of competing information patterns. This causes certain strong information patterns to emerge that are internally consistent with one another and able to enter into conscious awareness by extending into all related brain areas. So if a horse coming down the street draws your conscious attention, all participating parts of your brain will receive consistent, coherent information about such things as how the horse looks and the sounds it makes. Your brain needs a fraction of a second to make such information conscious, but the process is not static. It is a continuing, ongoing process. So the information entering consciousness changes from moment to moment as participating brain areas produce more processed information And as this new information enters the streams of information that are being competitively weeded out, selected, and harmonized to produce a progressively changing conscious state. Within this framework, some brain structures play a larger role in consciousness than others, and brain science can seek them out. We have already seen that the association areas of the cerebral cortex appear to be important. But beyond that, one structure that stands out like a beacon is the thalamus. The thalamus is right in the center of the brain, the best place for a principal coordinator of consciousness. It is fair-sized, large enough to do the job. It has a highly complex and varied structure, and it has a sheet of gray matter around it that acts as a filter, using incoming impulses to inhibit and screen out certain other impulses, weeding out some while letting others through. All this is consistent with coordination of consciousness. Beyond that, we know that various kinds of general anesthesia put consciousness in abeyance by depressing the activity of the thalamus. Medical histories and autopsies have shown that damaging the thalamus can destroy consciousness, leaving the subject alive but deprived of consciousness in a vegetative state. And we also know that destroying one small part of the thalamus, the region of the intralaminar thalamic nuclei on both sides of the brain, will abolish consciousness. Regarding sensory information, the thalamus is a relay station. It receives virtually all incoming information on everything you see, hear, taste, and touch, and sends it out to sensory processing areas. But there's more. All this information has to pass across at least one synapse in the thalamus. That means the results of coordinated and harmonized processing can be applied there, even before the incoming information goes out to primary processing areas in the cerebral cortex. So, like a trusted sixth grader assigned to help supervise school recess by keeping tabs on balls and other playthings, the thalamus has first dibs and some control over nearly all sensory information entering the brain. Even more interesting, the thalamus has lots of processed and harmonized information to apply. This includes processed sensory information from association areas of the cerebral cortex, conscious memory from the hippocampus and temporal areas, thought and emotion data from emotion centers and prefrontal areas, data on activated procedures from the basal ganglia, and various sorts of other data from the cerebellum and brainstem. What makes things really clear is that the neuron cables coming into the thalamus from these areas are massive, collectively about 10 times the size of the cables going out. This means that the thalamus is well equipped to receive lots of highly processed information, to compare and select from that information, and to send the results to many far-flung regions of the brain in a unified and coherent fashion consistent with the workings of consciousness. So here, for all appearances, is the master coordinator of consciousness, at least for the senses, and perhaps for thought, emotions, and consciously summoned memory as well. But there is no reason to think that the thalamus is the be-all and the end-all of consciousness. For we can see that various association areas are vital to coordinating consciousness, and that damage to certain of these areas alone can abolish consciousness. We can also see that lots of local and regional brain areas play a supporting role in consciousness, both by passing information along and by receiving information from prime areas participating in consciousness. This suggests that essentially the whole brain participates in consciousness directly or indirectly, either by helping to coordinate information that might enter the system, or by receiving harmonized information produced by the system. Certain brain areas are critical to the system, and damaging them will abolish consciousness as surely as disabling a car's engine will stop the car. But since nearly all brain areas contribute to consciousness in one way or another, damaging almost any brain area will diminish actual or potential consciousness to some degree, depending on that brain area's actual or potential contribution. This brings me to the end of this video. More information about how consciousness operates in sleep can be found in the video on consciousness and dreams in the Dream series. Beyond that, if you would like to know more about how consciousness works in general, or would like reference data supporting what I have said here, you can find both in the chapter on consciousness in my book, Dream World: How the Brain Dreams and Why.